Rejecting the landing from low altitude or on the runway is one of the most time-sensitive choices a pilot will ever make under normal conditions. However, what would happen if the plane in that scenario did something wholly different from what the captain had instructed? Keep an eye out. Modern aircraft are constructed to incredible safety standards, and the certification procedure is now so intricate that it's almost hard to understand. Furthermore, if a design flaw is discovered after an event or mishap, additional criteria are added. It is difficult to cover every circumstance, however, no matter how thorough these certifications are, particularly if the specified standard operating procedures are not fully followed, as this occurrence is a prime illustration of. A crew from TAP on Air Portugal was preparing to fly from Lisbon, Portugal, up to Denmark to Copenhagen Airport on April 8, 2022. The weather in Copenhagen was far less predictable, with strong, gusty winds, predicted rains, and a temperature of barely a few degrees Celsius. This was early April, so spring had already begun to arrive in Lisbon. In April, this kind of weather is normal for Scandinavia. We actually have a term for it in Sweden, a proverter. Additionally, this kind of fluctuating weather might pose a number of difficulties for pilots. Given that Copenhagen's runways were orientated either southwesterly or northwesterly, the projected winds in this instance were expected to be blowing from 270 degrees at 20 knots with gusts of up to 32. This meant that all runways would be vulnerable to severe, gusty crosswinds. The pilots of this airplane were anticipating landing on runway 30, which was the shortest and closest to the wind direction. The 40-year-old skipper had accrued almost 10,000 hours of cumulative time. He had flown around half of those on the Airbus A320, which was also the aircraft type they would be using. Awaiting this day, the 34-year-old first officer he would be working with had flown 3160 hours in total, most of which, more than 2,000 hours, were all the A320. Now, they decided that the captain would function as the pilot flying on the way up, which made great sense to me, considering the weather they were anticipating in Copenhagen and the runway's relative shortness. Since the captain is ultimately in charge, it is not unusual for them to decide to leave flights that are a little bit more difficult. The pilots continued their free flight after reviewing their weather, going over flight plans, no-thumbs, and technical modifications about the aircraft. When they were done, they briefed their 5 cabin crew members before heading out to the apron to begin the day. According to the tech log, the Airbus A320-214 that they were allocated for the journey was in excellent flying condition. The Airbus A320 series had 2 engine choices when it was approved. This aircraft was equipped with the CFM56 and the International Aero Engines 2500. I'll go into more detail later, but this engine, and particularly certain of its parts, will play a significant role in this narrative. While the captain was setting up the cockpit, the first officer finished his walk around and found nothing unusual for him. The 102 passengers were greeted by the cabin staff in the meanwhile, and once everyone was prepared and the pilots had finished their pre-flight, the aircraft was pushed back and its engines began. Following clearance, the pilots tacked it out and flew in accordance with their flight plan, heading northeast. At that point, everything was operating perfectly normally. The pilots had plenty of opportunity to investigate the anticipated landing circumstances in further depth on the journey up into Copenhagen. They believed that the runway would be wet due to the nearby rain showers, which sometimes even included snow. This would result in a braking penalty and a longer landing distance. Due to a misplaced threshold, runway 30's 2365 meters of length only has 2095 meters accessible for landing. Even though the runway wasn't very long, especially considering that there were only 102 people on board, it was a little more difficult because of the strong gusts. We usually want to utilize as many flaps as possible to increase drag and decrease our approach speed while landing on short runways. On the 737 I fly, however, we usually have less margins up to the flap over speed if we use higher flap settings because more is essentially just hanging around, making it more sensitive. Because it is somewhat more stable to fly with fewer landing flaps, such as flap 30, we often employ it when landing in very windy circumstances. However, my Airbus acquaintances tell me that the Airbus A320 has far less leeway for overspeeding and is actually a little more stable with full flaps. This makes it somewhat more difficult to comprehend the flap selection that these pilots finally made. Their decision may have been influenced by a statement in their handbook stating that pilots should still think about employing less flaps in windy circumstances. I'm not sure. In any event, documents indicate that they carried out 3 distinct landing computations, each with a different autobrake and flap configuration. Ultimately, they chose to use flaps in configuration 3, which entails autobrake medium and flaps angled 20 degrees. Curiously, they had not included that combination in their calculations, but it would still provide them with a landing distance of 1540 meters, which was well within the range that was accessible. They calculated a landing distance of 1930 meters with flap configuration 3 and low autobrake, which made them a little uneasy since they only had around 2,000 meters available. As a result, they increased the autobrake. It would make sense even without doing any further calculations. Since I previously said that the pilots anticipated strong crosswinds during the landing, now is probably a good moment to discuss why that would present an issue. To put it simply, as pilots, we don't really worry about crosswinds while we're flying at higher altitude since, to ensure that the proper track is being followed, the aircraft must tip its nose into the wind. By the way, the difference between heading and track is that wind correction angle. However, the aircraft must suddenly adjust to land on a strip that is set in a certain direction on the ground when it comes to takeoff and landing. This implies that, similar to how a boat must cross a river to reach a designated mooring on the other side, we must maneuver the aircraft to line up with that final approach track. Just as that boat would need to pitch its bow into the river's current to achieve the same thing, we would point the nose into the wind as we got closer to the runway to make sure we continued on that last approach track. This technique, known as creating a crab angle, works really well as long as you can bring the plane down to the runway. We must decrab or align ourselves with the runway right before landing, because once you're over the runway, you can't actually land with this crab angle in, or at least not the whole amount of crab angle, as this would put a lot of pressure on the landing gear. This is particularly crucial on dry runways since, on wet and slick ones, landing with a crab would result in somewhat reduced side pressures. Nevertheless, as soon as the plane decrabs, the crosswinds will begin to push you in the direction of the downwind runway edge. This decrab must therefore occur very late in the landing sequence, which means that pilots frequently have to combine the decrabbing and the flare simultaneously. This can help maintain directional control, and aircraft are limited to a maximum amount of crosswind in order to stay on the runway. That usually ranges between 30 and 35 knots, which decreases as the runway becomes slicker since it becomes more difficult to maintain directional control. As you can see, landing in a crosswind is a technically challenging operation. As a result, pilots with less experience may be subject to further limitations on the maximum amount of crosswind they are permitted to use. For instance, an aircraft may be limited to 30 knots, while a novice pilot may only be able to reach 15. These kinds of limitations often vary throughout airlines. However, flying approaches with crosswinds near maximum requires intense concentration from even seasoned pilots, and it gets significantly more difficult when such winds are strong. Additionally, it's a good idea to land on a short runway if you have to do so. You may be certain that the person in charge will be very vigilant and will use every possible method to bring the aircraft down safely and promptly and to a complete stop as soon as possible. At 9:56, the pilots got the most recent weather information from ATIS Charlie. It showed that with a wind of 250 degrees and 24 knots gusting 29, runway 30 was operating as planned. This would have provided advertising. Crosswind component of around 20 knots on average. A combination snow and rain shower had just passed the airport 10 minutes before to the plane's scheduled landing, and storm clouds were also present in the area of the airport, according to the report. Overall, there was nothing preventing the pilots from really beginning their approach because of the excellent vision and cloud layers. In accordance with their customary protocols, the crew requested their traffic control for first descent after the captain had briefed the first officer for a typical ILS approach onto runway 30. I previously promised to provide some technical information on the CFM56 engines installed on this Airbus before we dive into the event sequence. They were essentially the same two-shaft high bypass turbofans that are used on the Boeing 737 NG that I fly, with a few little variations in fan diameter and structure. However, there was a significant distinction. The hydraulically operated translating sleeves that make up the 737's truss reverser system shift the air flowing through the bypass duct in a forward direction when they are engaged. Instead, 4 pivoting blocker doors were used to achieve the similar effect on the Airbus engines. These doors were likewise hydraulically operated by independent actuator arms for each door, and they were sealed shut by a separate hydro-mechanical main door latch in addition to a tine within the actuator. The Engine Control Unit, or ECU, was in charge of these latches and activators. It relied on a number of digital inputs, including the angle of the truss lever that was sensed in the cockpit, signals from the position microswitches in the reverser doors, and above all, the air-ground sensing signals from the weight-on-wheel switches located inside each main landing gear. These switches were one of the necessary signals for the truss reversers to work, both for activation and deactivation, and they would turn on when the shock absorbers compressed off the landing. Now, as I said in a previous episode, the necessary modifications after the horrific Laudair 004 disaster were the reason why the reversers had 2 different locks installed. Theoretically, the changes should have prevented the deployment of in-flight reversers. The Airbus pilots now had to lift up 2 flaps on the front of the truss levers, and then move the truss levers further back than the forward truss idle position in order to actually engage the reversers. The ECU would then begin unlocking and activating the blocker doors, and if it sensed that the aircraft was on the ground, would begin spooling up the engines to supply the reverse truss. A go-around may be started at any time until the reversers have been caught, as those of you who have been watching this channel for a long are aware. Chosen. However, a go-around is no longer a possibility after the pilots had chosen reverses, since they are fully committed to the landing. However, even if you may have heard it before, you may not understand why. In addition, what are you waiting for if you haven't been watching the channel? Now subscribe! In any case, we should never walk around after choosing reverse thrusts for a number of reasons. First of all, if a go-around is requested, it will take a while for the aircraft to switch from reverse thrust to deactivate and lock the reverses before spooling the engine up again. This means that there may not be enough thrust available in a timely manner to carry out the go-around safely. Equally crucial, however, is to avoid ever putting the airplane in a situation where you run the danger of using one engine's maximum forward thrust, while the second engine is still only using low or even reverse thrust. In fact, this has occurred. In 1978, Pacific Airlines Flight 314 went down at Canada's Cranbrook International Airport. Since then, pilots on all kinds of aircraft have rigorously maintained the rule that you should never try to fly around once reverses have been chosen. The Cranbrook incident also altered the certification standards for transport category aircraft to ensure that, despite the fact that it should never happen, an aircraft could always land, choose reverses, stall them again, and apply takeoff thrusts with both reverses deactivating safely. Initially introduced in Canada, these new regulations were later adopted by the FAA in the US. Although the IASA in Europe did not adopt the exact identical regulations, all aircraft manufacturers still essentially adhere to them. However, aircraft were not really assessed for conformity with these certification requirements until they had completely landed and chosen reverse thrust. Keep it in mind. After a few minutes after 10 UTC, TAP Flight 174 was turned over to the Copenhagen approach controller, who began vectoring them for the ILS approach for runway 30. Eventually, they were granted slow descent clearances down into Copenhagen. The captain began requesting that the flaps be extended since the pilots had already finished all pertinent checklists, with the exception of the landing checklist, and the aircraft had completely intercepted the ILS by 10 o'clock when it began to descend towards the runway. Despite the stormy weather on approach, the pilots were able to maneuver the landing gear down at times 10, 0, 1, and 55 seconds. The flaps were then placed into position 3, which is the landing position. When the pilots were turned over from the approach controller to the Castro Tower controller, they were fully set up for the landing. However, before to the handover, the previous controller requested that the crew attempt to exit the runway via the taxiway Delta. The crew remarked that this was a little much to ask for, and it would make the available rollout distance much shorter, 15-30 meters to be precise. However, a request from the tower is just that, a request, and if the aircraft is unable to fulfill it, then that is the reality. However, as pilots, we always make an effort to comply with such requests whenever possible. The pilots probably understood that Copenhagen was only utilizing runway 30 for arrivals at this time, so they probably made this request in an attempt to reduce the aircraft's time on the runway. In any case, the plane dropped 14-20 feet during this time, and the captain abruptly chose to turn off the autopilot and proceed with the approach by hand. We pilots tend to deactivate the autopilot a little early in poor weather. However, it can be utilized much lower than that and even halt the minimum if necessary. In addition to the fact that it's a lot of fun, we usually do this to attempt to gain a better feel for the aircraft and be ready for the next manual landing. The tower controller gave the go-ahead for TAP Flight 174 to land on runway 30 at times 10, 05, and 5. Now that the aircraft was completely prepared for landing, the captain was probably very focused on getting the aircraft down correctly on the mark and getting the brakes and reverses working as soon as possible, especially with the wet runway that he could now clearly see ahead of him. This was likely due to the gusty winds and the requests from the tower controllers. Down beyond the threshold, when the GPS began crying out, the approach proceeded steadily with just little speed variations. At 30 feet, the captain initiated the flare and concurrently straightened the aircraft out from the crowd. At this moment, his hands were just resting on the reverser flaps. He pushed up the flaps and immediately jerked the truss levers back into reverse truss as soon as the wheels began spinning up, before the shock absorbers had fully compressed. As previously stated, the reversers would only turn on when the weight on wheel switches were completely engaged, which also occurred quickly. As a result, the reverser doors began to open on both sides. Additionally, the wing spoilers turned on simultaneously, shifting the aircraft's weight onto the brakes and shock absorbers. However, the plane also began to roll and drift slightly to the right, most likely as a result of the severe crosswinds, which briefly brought the left landing gear back into the air. Instead of completing the landing, the captain began doing an abrupt go-around, sometimes referred to as a bulk landing, since he didn't enjoy this rolling and drifting action at all. A bulk landing, as I said at the outset, is a move that calls for a great deal of hard yet sensitive handling. Because the aircraft was in a right bank, this is to prevent over-rotating, which might result in a tail strike, or, in this instance, a wing or nacelle hit. Ensuring the aircraft is flying at the right speed and attitude is also crucial for safety. Once again, but when he now shifted the truss levers from reverse to full toga truss, an odd thing began to occur. A different set of signals were now transmitted from the ECU to the truss reverser circuit, since this choice had been made during a short bounce when the right gear was still contacting but the left gear was in the air. The right engine's reversers steered as intended and began raising the forward truss for the go-around because the weight on wheel switches were still engaged. The STO commands were then transmitted and stored in the computer's execution memory for the following 8 seconds. However, the left engine also got the identical orders, but it was not locked into memory and was not performed since its main gear was signaling airborne at the precise 180 milliseconds that this command was sent. As the engine was forced into full forward thrusts, this resulted in 3 of the 4 reverser doors remaining open, increasing drag. As the aircraft resumed its first bounce, both weight on wheel switches quickly turned back on, but nothing changed since the orders had already been transmitted. It's probable that the captain didn't even fully realize he had engaged reversers when he decided to go around, since the first officer in the cockpit had not had time to call out either reverser on closed door spoilers before the captain made the choice. However, I would want to emphasize once again that you should never attempt to go around once the reversers have been chosen, because what was happening now resembled a scenario from a work of fiction. Fortunately, the system saw that the reversers were still deployed and engaged something called out to idle, which prevented the left engine from spooling up as the right engine did. Although it was still rather horrible, this fact was perhaps the only thing that prevented the situation from being instantly disastrous. The airplane immediately began to yaw and roll to the left due to the massive amount of asymmetric power from the screaming right engine and the now idle left one. The captain, who was completely unprepared for this, began attempting to steer the airplane, but it is clear that his input was not quick enough. This indicated that the aircraft was now lurching toward the left side of the runway, with its left wingtip only feet from the ground. Upon seeing that the go-around maneuver had been launched, the first officer chose to set the flap lever to position 2, which was the go-around setting. The plane bounced once more until the nose gradually raised enough to launch it into the air, narrowly clearing the runway's left edge, but not much higher. In addition to the fact that the slip and skid indication on his main flight display, which was the beta goal, had ceased working and had been replaced with a flag, the captain was still having difficulty comprehending why his once completely functional aircraft was now almost unreliable. When dealing with asymmetric thrust, this indicator is very helpful because it tells the pilot how much rudder to input to fly the aircraft correctly and allow it to climb. Normally, it indicates whether the aircraft is slipping, which means turning with too little rudder, or skidding, which means turning with too much rudder. That indication would have been quite useful in this situation, but sadly, it was said that an internal computer setting would prevent it from working if the thrust reverses were chosen. In any event, the plane proceeded, barely leaving the runway's safety zone and rising high enough to avoid colliding with the glide slope antenna for the runway on the other side. The pilot determined that they had sufficient positive climb rate at that point to retract the gear, and the first officer followed suit. Then he yelled, "Go around to ATC," and he saw an ATC practically simultaneously. On the aircraft's ECAM display, the Engine 1 reverser unlocked alert. The captain eventually received an explanation for his aircraft's behavior when he pointed this out to him. In response, he deflected the right rudder by roughly half and then lifted the nose to 12.5 degrees, which is the climb attitude to maintain in the event of an engine failure after takeoff. This eventually caused the plane to ascend at a speed of around 1,000 feet per minute once again, although it only went a few meters over the homes in a neighboring town. Upon reaching a radial height of around 300 feet, the captain called Castrop Tower for a mayday and asked to go directly to 3,000 feet. As I've said in a number of my earlier films, it's usually preferable to follow the golden rule of aviate, navigate, and then communicate, even if there may be a strong desire to communicate in such circumstances. For example, ATC does not need to know that you are in an emergency at 300 feet or that you are going around at 10 feet. At that moment, it's best to focus only on piloting the aircraft and safely removing it from any terrain and impediments. In any case, the tower clearly granted the request. The aircraft proceeded to ascend, and the first officer began executing the ECAM procedures for the Engine 1 reverser unlock warning they received as soon as it was judged suitable. They achieved this by totally turning off the left engine as the plane climbed to a height of roughly 1,200 feet. Following that, the beta target indicator abruptly reappeared. Better late than never, I suppose. In order to be ready for the following phase, the captain now went ahead and engaged the autopilot once again while continuing to ascend to 3,000 feet. Before I reveal the conclusion of this tale, I would want to use this time to make some very crucial points. This event brought to light a hitherto undiscovered flaw in the Airbus ECU reverse logic on CFM56 powered Airbus A320 suited. We are now working on a modification to address this issue, and the same is true for the berth index or side slip issue. Having said that, Airbus also examined all of the data they had on hand, which included over 95 million flights of this specific aircraft type. It seems that this was the sole instance of this exact defect ever occurring. However, what they discovered when examining that data may be even more concerning. As you can see, the incidence of pilots landing, choosing reverse thrust, and then continuing to fly around occurred around once per million flights. That may seem very uncommon, but given the volume of flights we now operate using the Airbus A320, at the absolute least, it indicates that this occurs on average once per month. And keep in mind that the Airbus A320 was the sole aircraft used in this experiment. If you are a pilot and you want to take away one thing from this video, it should be that if you have landed and selected reverse thrust, you are staying on the ground and a rejected landing is no longer an option. This is because the rule of never going around after thrust reverses have been deployed is common for the entire airline and the world, and we all pilots react pretty much the same way to the same conditions. This could indicate that this same thing is happening on all fleets and therefore represents a very real risk, possibly a bigger risk than I have ever seen in the context of these investigations before. The crew of Light 174 finally leveled off at 3,000 feet and then completed the associated checklist. They then briefed their cabin crew and passengers and returned for vectors into a successful single-engine landing on runway 22 left in Copenhagen about 20 minutes after this terrible ordeal had begun. They chose that runway because it had an available landing distance of 3,300 meters, which was significantly longer than runway 30. I would encourage you to fit these parameters into your OFDM system, landing reverse thrust selected, and then go around within the next 10 seconds. It would be really interesting to hear what kind of information that type of check will bring about, because it's possible that we have a serious problem here, which they had previously utilized. Since the approach is flown with lower flap settings and thus higher speeds, extra distance is something that is really needed when landing a single-engine aircraft. Once they had landed, the aircraft crashed into the stand, allowing all 109 passengers and crew to safely disembark. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were successfully saved and downloaded, along with footage from the airport's surveillance cameras and pilot witness statements. The investigation team later pieced this story together piece by piece. I've already discussed some of the safety recommendations that emerged from this investigation, but it was also suggested that the certification requirements for new aircraft be updated once more. This time around, it is necessary for the reverse system to be able to be properly and entirely canceled both after a successful full landing and in the worst-case situation, during a bounce landing. As a result, aviation is currently making even more progress in enhancing safety, and the finest type of progress is one in which no one is harmed. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Stay safe, and see you in the next one.